So in this video, we were asked to talk about how cellular respiration happens and the flow of energy from glucose to ATP. Glucose is used to create ATP through cellular respirations. Cellular respiration is mostly a catabolic process, meaning that it breaks down the complex molecules we ingest so we can use those molecules in anabolic reactions, meaning the building up of complex molecules to carry out the functions that our bodies need them to do. In the first part of it, glycolysis takes place. Glycolysis molecule has a CH bond, and that bond stores ATP, and when those bonds are released through the process, allowing for the release/creation of ATP, glycolysis breaks down the molecule of glucose into two separate molecules of pyruvate, which are each made of 3 carbons each. While pyruvate is being formed, 4 ATP molecules are created, and 2 FADH2 molecules are created, which become the active carrier molecules. And oxygen is needed to undergo glycolysis, but there's still some partial oxidation happening in the way that the 2 NAD molecules are reduced to form the 2 NADH molecules. The pyruvate is taken into the mitochondria, where it becomes coenzyme A, creating acetyl coenzyme A, which is another carrier molecule. And then it goes into the Krebs cycle, where the carbon-hydrogen bonds are broken apart, and they release more electrons, and those are accepted by the NADH plus and the FAD, creating the NADH and the FADH2, and the carbon is being oxidized and then released as carbon dioxide, so it is using oxygen. The Krebs cycle is it requires oxygen to happen. So at the end of the Krebs cycle, from glycolysis to Krebs, you end up with 3 NADH, 1 FADH2, and 2 carbon dioxides. And an entire Krebs cycle happens for each pyruvate, so it happens twice for from one single glucose molecule, since those carbon molecules were broken into 2 pyruvates originally. The NADH and the FADH carries the electrons into the electron transport chain, where it passes the electrons to the oxygen through the membrane, and then it goes into ATP synthase, which turns the water and that rushes through, creating into ATP, creating the bulk of ATP. You end up with 38 ATP from this process when all is said and done. When anaerobic respiration happens, the same process is followed, but the molecules that receive the electrons are of non-oxygen species, and it may or may not usually be as efficient. When we compare these processes to molecules that do fermentation instead, fermentation does not process the process past the glycolysis cycle into the Krebs or the electron transport chain. It just goes through the glycolysis and creates NADH, ATP, and 2 pyruvates, and then the electrons are transported to the pyruvate and other chemicals, and this process is not as energy efficient since the net is only 2 ATP molecules, and this process either creates lactate or ethanol, and these things are how we make food, such as cheese, bread, yogurt, drinks like beers and wines. Our muscles also ferment lactic acid during heavy exercise when they're not receiving enough oxygen, but in molecules that have the option to do either, will always pick the option that will generate the most energy, so they will prefer aerobic respiration and go through the whole cellular respiration cycle. But in the case that oxygen is not available, they will go through the fermentation cycle and create their ATP that way, which is less efficient, but they also still get the ATP that they need in the long run. So that's it.